Welcome to the Land Matters podcast. I'm your host, Anthony Flint. On this show, we're going to talk about zoning, not something most people think about on a daily basis, but as it turns out, these rules have a real impact on all of our lives and the communities we all live in. For this conversation, we have two people who are right at the cutting edge of zoning and the idea of reforming zoning for greater affordability and sustainability and less racial segregation. Nolan Gray, a city planner, research director for the group California YIMBY, that is, Yes in My Backyard, and author of the recent book Arbitrary Lines, How Zoning Broke the American City and How to Fix It. And Sara Bronin, professor at Cornell University and founder of the National Zoning Atlas, a project we'll hear about in just a few moments. This conversation comes at a time when at least 10 states are moving forward with efforts to modify zoning at the local level to remove restrictions on multifamily housing development near transit stations, for example. The rationale is that there's not nearly enough affordable housing, and local land use regulations skew towards single-family homes on large lots, which are inevitably more expensive. That's just one example of the kind of reform or overhaul that's being proposed. We start out with some basic definitions before getting into how things have gone awry and what can be done to change that. Nolan and Sara, thank you for joining the conversation at Land Matters. First and foremost, let's try to answer the question, what is zoning? What's the history and how is it affecting daily life? Nolan, let's start with you.
Well, first, thanks for having me on, Anthony. It's a real pleasure to be here. In the book, I define zoning as trying to do two basic things within a framework where we're taking every single parcel in a given city, assigning it to a zoning district, and each one of those zoning districts has two provisions. The first is what are the permissible land uses? So what can you do on your property? The broad buckets there are residential, commercial, industrial. But then, of course, within each of those categories, there's infinite variation there. You can have residential districts that allow duplexes, but not townhouses. 70 to 90% of the typical US city, the only thing allowed in a residential district is detached single family housing. Distinctions among commercial, distinctions among industrial, light industrial, heavy industrial. That's the first thing that zoning is trying to do in the US context. The second is systematically restrict density, limit the number of units that you can build on any particular parcel, limit the amount of floor area, place rules on the size and scale of a building. So how tall it can be or how large the setbacks have to be or how much parking has to be provided. Those are really kind of the two pillars of what zoning in the US varies a little bit in other contexts, but that's broadly how I define zoning, and that's broadly what I'm critiquing in my book.
So it sounds like it's the rules of the game. Sara, would you agree with that, or could you add to what zoning is and has become?
Sure. So zoning is the local government regulation of land uses, structures, and lots through the assignment of lots to distinctly regulated districts. So Nolan gave us great examples of different kinds of land uses. The structures are also something that zoning codes regulate, things like height and bulk and floor to area ratio, and lots too, setbacks, lot sizes, and so on. Zoning comes to us really from the 1920s. 100 years ago is when zoning started to emerge in this country. States adopted enabling acts pursuant to U.S. Department of Commerce guidance, and these enabling acts empowered local governments to enact zoning. All 50 states have these acts, and tens of thousands of jurisdictions across the country have zoning. I would argue that zoning is the most significant regulatory power of local government because it governs not only where we can put housing and factories and parks and shops, as Nolan said, but it actually has significant impacts on the economy and even, I think, the very structure of our society. So zoning is extremely important, and helping people to understand it is something that Nolan has done, and I hope that all of us can continue to do.
All right. Well, Nolan, you have written a whole book about zoning, so let's get right after it. Something has gone wrong with zoning, in your view. Tell us about that. What has gone wrong before we get into solutions?
Yeah, so in the book, I surveyed 4 of the major critiques that you hear of zoning today. And I think, once this was really an obscure area of policy, the type of thing where if you mention that you work on zoning at a party, the person will have to politely go refill their drink or use the bathroom. Now it's this thing that I think a lot of people are hearing about, they're thinking about. It's something that you really can't listen to a political debate without hearing about now. There's four things going on here. The first is housing affordability. The thicket of zoning rules and process that we've inherited from previous generations makes it illegal to build a lot of the housing that we need. It requires that much of the housing that is built be quite a bit more expensive than it might otherwise have been. Not only, for example, taking the form of maybe a detached single family home, but as Sarah was mentioning, being on a larger lot or having additional parking spaces. And then it adds regulatory delay and additional process to the entire process. So it might take, for example, 6 months to 2 years to get a permit in a context where the zoning is particularly tight and you have to pursue some type of discretionary permitting timeline. Second big critique that I discuss in the book is these zoning rules are in many cases strictest in some of our most productive areas. Historically, Americans moved from poor, lower productivity regions to wealthy, highly productive cities. That's how they improved their standard of living, their lot in life. Of course, Americans now do the opposite. And that's really because downstream of the housing cost issue, restrictive zoning rules in places like San Francisco and New York have made housing prices so expensive that a lot of regular people just move away. And there's really compelling evidence within the urban economics literature that this has pretty serious downstream economic implications, that we're all poorer and a little bit less innovative as a result. The third is the intersection with racial and economic equity. So, I was writing this book over the course of 2020. I was literally living in downtown DC as the Black Lives Matter protests were happening. And there was a real reckoning with the way that a lot of the laws and institutions and norms that we've inherited continue to perpetuate inequality along racial lines. And if you really look at the origins of the zoning codes that many cities still have on the books, they were explicitly segregationist, or the earliest codes were adopted in response to court efforts tampering down on racial zoning. Modern codes in many cases still exist largely to perpetuate segregation, to keep poor separated from rich, to build communities that are not integrated. And of course, that has huge downstream implications for access to high quality jobs and public services. Then the fourth and final one is the relationship between zoning and some of our environmental or climate change objectives. There are a few elements of it here. Just about the only type of development that zoning isn't actively antagonistic toward is single family detached housing on the periphery, development that will inherently require more land, that will require more driving. So of course, there's as we try to reduce transportation related greenhouse gas emissions, that's a huge issue. This notion that land uses should be separate, right? I mean, if you look at historical pre-zoning neighborhoods, the standard would be that you would have life's daily necessities within walking distance. You might have a corner grocery, you might have a corner barbershop, you might have a corner medical office, or at least cities could achieve densities such that transit would actually work. There was density high enough to be able to take a bus or even to take a train. Of course, zoning makes all of that very difficult, and it really privileges the most environmentally inefficient land use patterns. I don't have any hard feelings for people who want to live in a detached single-family home, but if you actually just look at prices, it's clear that many Americans actually want to live in an apartment in a walkable neighborhood where they might not have a car, and zoning in many cases criminalizes that.
Wow, this is why we're so glad to be having this conversation. Zoning is making things more expensive, it's exacerbating racial segregation, and it's bad for the environment. That is quite a package, among other things. Sara, is that what you have found? It sounds like it's a system that's perpetuating some bad things.
Well, zoning has been adopted by tens of thousands of jurisdictions across the country. And Nolan's right that the origins of zoning were, in some cases, pretty discriminatory. If we look at the way that local governments have adopted zoning, much of these ordinances are the same across jurisdictions, but we don't know exactly to what extent some of these criticisms hold true across jurisdictions nationally. In fact, we don't really have a good handle over the way that jurisdictions zone because we haven't really studied that. So we do have some idea that many jurisdictions have large lot zoning. We have an understanding that a lot of our land is zoned for single family residential, but we don't know the exact amounts and we don't know how that varies from one region to another. There have been some studies done on that, but they've been only involved a handful of jurisdictions. And so I think while Nolan is right about many of these criticisms, they probably do hold true in the vast majority of jurisdictions across the country. I think we need more information to understand how big the problem is, because only then can we understand how we can fix it.
Well, that's a natural segue to your project, the Zoning Atlas. Can you tell us about that? It seems like we need a little bit more information, or at least an agreed upon reality. And how will the Zoning Atlas help get us there?
The National Zoning Atlas is an effort to try to translate and standardize those tens of thousands of zoning codes across the country into an interactive map that somebody from the general public can understand. So our thought is that we need to go out and read zoning codes, which have been adopted by big cities, small towns, suburbs, rural areas, and come in many different forms. Even for an expert, these zoning codes can be hard to read, and it's nearly impossible to compare them to each other. So the Zoning Atlas is being worked on right now by teams all over the country to try to help us democratize that information. And it really started in Connecticut through an effort called Desegregate Connecticut, which I guess I founded in 2000. And when we started that zoning reform effort here, we kept getting asked, but how does my town zone? And how does it compare to another town? And we realized that we couldn't answer that question. And so we started collecting all the zoning codes in the state, 180 in total. We collected GIS maps, collected or created GIS maps for all of those jurisdictions, and matched district-specific criteria to the map so that somebody can now click on the Connecticut Zoning Atlas, look at their town, and see how it compares with other communities. We also had from that atlas a really rich array of findings that reinforce in Connecticut the fact that we don't zone as well as we could, given all that we know about the consequences of zoning. So the Atlas has revealed in Connecticut that there's a long way to go. And we think that the same will be true in states across the country. And so that's what we're trying to do with the National Zoning Atlas Project.
Well, Nolan, there's one common denominator here, and that is zoning is the purview of local government at that level. So you start with this challenge at that local level, but there's also been something else going on that I hoped you could tell us about, and that is established residents and others sort of grabbing on to some of these obsolete rules or the rules as they are and using it essentially to fend off development. We're going to talk about solutions, but could you just talk a little bit about that phenomenon?
I think just to kind of riff a little bit more on the project that Sara was talking about, something that is a defining feature of zoning in the US is that it's a state delegated power, but local governments have basically almost complete authority to write zoning codes. Depending on the state court system, there might be different guardrails around that, but they generally have extremely wide latitude. A very peculiar feature of the US zoning system is zoning can vary dramatically from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. And this is partly why it's actually kind of hard to speak in broad strokes about zoning. That's why, the chapter in my book where I'm defining zoning has all of these horrible hedge words, like probably, mostly, for the most part, right? The type of thing that an editor goes through with a red pen. And it's like, well, like you can't actually say anything universally about the operationalization of US zoning codes for stuff like setbacks or lot sizes. But I think another sort of element here of having this extreme decentralization and how these codes are written is that it's very easy for, particularly in smaller jurisdictions, interest groups that maybe don't represent even majorities within that jurisdiction, or certainly don't represent the broader population of a metropolitan area, can use these rules toward potentially selfish or self-servicing ends, right? So a small jurisdiction can incorporate and adopt rules that are very, very, very strict and don't allow any affordable housing, both of the naturally occurring variety and of the subsidized variety, to be built in their jurisdiction. And this is an interesting trend that you see more broadly within the US. Individual neighborhoods are becoming more integrated in the aftermath of the Fair Housing Act, but metropolitan areas, any given jurisdiction, we're seeing higher rates of segregation there. So this is why, and just to tease what we'll talk about later, there's more and more of a role for state governments to play in saying, okay, hey, we're going to step in and put guardrails around the use of some of these state delegated powers to make sure that they're not being used toward exclusionary ends or antisocial ends that harm the metropolitan area as a whole. Because housing markets don't start and stop at municipal boundaries. Housing markets track onto labor markets, which track onto metropolitan areas. When you're looking for a house, you're not saying like, well, I'm looking for a house only in the suburb. You're looking for a house in an entire metro area. And so there's this mismatch here of the scale of the markets and where the actual regulation is being set.
Let's talk about some of these efforts at reform. And it does set up a potential conflict, or at least my sense is that there's already a little bit of pushback. And Sara, I'm hoping you can talk about your Connecticut experience. When there's a statewide proposal to sort of clean things up or to do any sort of reform or change the rules, as we've seen in Oregon and plenty of other places with eliminating single family only zoning. The pushback appears to come from that sort of almost grassroots level or the neighborhood level involving established residents who don't want to see change. Sara, could you talk about the experience in Connecticut when some of these reform proposals were made and then things sort of got chipped away at or diluted? Tell that story, if you would.
Sure. When we started Desegregate Connecticut, we knew that there was a place in public conversation for zoning and that the time was right to link reform of our outdated zoning laws with much better social and economic outcomes that would be beneficial to Connecticut as a whole. We started a public conversation about zoning that I think surprised people in the traction that it gained and the allies that it gained. So unlike other zoning reform efforts in other states, which are primarily bolstered by affordable housing advocates, here in Connecticut, we were able to get the support of environmental groups, our major statewide environmental groups, the preservation statewide groups, the home builders, of course, also active in many states on zoning reform, and social justice organizations and unions that collectively joined the cry to legislators that we needed to have some structural reforms of zoning in order to promote a better Connecticut. When we started, most people reminded us that Connecticut is named the land of steady habits. Things take a long time to change here, and we recognize that that's true. But nonetheless, with language in hand, state legislators ended up passing a lot of our suggested reforms. Like many other states, it was a start. There's a multi-year effort that has to be continued in order to continue to make reforms. But I think that the thought that there will always be opposition to zoning reform is becoming outdated, and very rapidly so. We're finding new coalitions to support zoning reform, not just here in Connecticut, but nationally. And we are seeing that groups that have long been hurt by zoning are being awakened to the impact of zoning and being more interested in engaging at the local level, at the state level, and even at the national level. So I'm pretty optimistic about these efforts. And Connecticut may be just one example, a small example, but you are seeing that in states across the country as well.
Nolan, jump in here and let's talk a little bit about the assortment of reforms that we're actually talking about here. They seem aimed at allowing more dense multifamily housing at appropriate locations for accessory dwelling units, also reducing or eliminating minimum parking requirements. What's the collection of reforms that you think have the best chance of success? And just walk us through how it plays out if these reforms are made.
Here at California YIMBY, we just had one of our best reform years yet. I think one of the benefits of being furthest along in a crisis is that folks are most open to new solutions. And of course, housing prices in California had one of their worst years yet from an affordability perspective last year. So there's a huge appetite. I think Sara's exactly right. There's a huge appetite across the political spectrum for reform ideas here. I'd say, broadly speaking, a few of the reforms that have worked really well in California. First is putting up guardrails around the substance of local zoning rules. So what do I mean by that? A really successful reform adopted here in California in 2016 was statewide legalization of accessory dwelling units, or ADUs. Those are basically additional little rental units that can be maybe in an unused two-car garage or in an unused attic or an unused basement. They're good for homeowners because they can tap into an additional source of income, and they're good for renters because it generally creates a rental unit in a higher opportunity neighborhood. As I highlight recently in The Atlantic, those reforms helped kick off the permitting of something like 60,000 new ADUs, in many cases in some of the most exclusionary jurisdictions in the state. A reform that we passed this year that I'm actually really proud of is AB 2097, which eliminates minimum parking requirements with certain provisions added within a half mile of transit statewide. These are elements of local zoning where we know that the local rules don't reflect our broader values. They don't reflect modern planning objectives. And the state can just say, hey, we're going to set a statewide standard here. I think another set of reforms that have been really important is the process piece of it. So it's all well and good to have great rules, but if it takes a really long time to get a permit, or if the permitting process is unpredictable, units aren't going to get built. And that's going to really fall hardest on your small local developers who might not have an in-house planner or an in-house land use attorney. to help him or her get the permits. So setting things like a shot clock, having rules on revision loops that of course can kill applications, exempting projects that we know don't have an environmental impact from excessive environmental review processes. That's all been very important. And then the third is beefing up state housing fair share law. So California, like many states, adopted rules in the 60s and 70s to say, hey, we're going to set up statewide provisions to make sure that everyone's permitting their fair share of housing based on population growth and economic indicators. And of course, a really important part of this is income restricted housing, affordable housing, making sure that you're not concentrating all of your subsidized income restricted housing in certain places. But for 50 years, that had no teeth. Really, nothing came out of it. And I think a huge amount of progress has been made from YIMBYs taking a lot of those laws and saying, hey, let's make these work. Let's add some teeth to this. If a city's not on track to meet some of their planning objectives, let's just make it much easier for developers who want to build projects that have affordable units, make it easier for them to get their permits. And that's been hugely successful, of course. The politics, as Sara suggested, are not nearly as bad as a lot of folks seem to think. They think of zoning as like this third rail. I think that's very much not the case. It's still a fight. You have to get folks to the table and have conversations and help them understand the issue. Like I say, in California, right, we're in a situation where so many folks just don't have access to affordable, decent housing. Folks are having to move out of state. Even people who are the beneficiaries of the California housing crisis, maybe folks who bought a home a few decades ago, they're finding that their adult children can't live within 2 or 3 hours of them. They're finding that if they want to retire, they probably have to leave the state. There's a huge amount of reform energy here in California. And I think states like California and Connecticut are really the canary in the coal mine. Something that I've been impressed by over the last 2 years is the extent to which people in places like Utah or people in places like Tennessee are saying, oh, we're having housing affordability issues, maybe for the first time in modern history, or housing affordability issues that are affecting the middle class. And they're looking for solutions. So, I think there's a lot of room here for more proactive elected officials to lead on this issue all across the country.
I think you'd agree the earlier notions of zoning reform focused a little bit more on the environmental side and accompanying the smart growth movement and looking at the separation of uses and how that was playing out in terms of land use. But I'm getting the sense that you and Sara agree that housing affordability is a primary driver here in terms of support for zoning reform. Would you agree with that, Sara? Affordability being front and center?
Certainly, people are drawn to the conversation about zoning because of housing prices, which have been affected not only by zoning, but a variety of market forces that continue to unfold as we speak. But the other thing I think is drawing people to these conversations, at least here in Connecticut, is the environmental consequences of zoning. So the way that we have essentially locked in car-dependent society through our large lot, single-use zoning is really detrimental, not just to the environment because it requires driving, but to our experience of place and our sense of the quality of place. So I think that people may be interested primarily in housing affordability issues, but there is a substantial and growing number of people who are looking at the environmental consequences of our current zoning practices and curious to know how they can help to fix those.
Yeah, it's remarkable. In Massachusetts, it was observed that everybody loves a New England town like Concord with town green and the density that it has, and that essentially it's illegal to build that kind of town today. So it's at odds with what people are really looking for these days. Would you agree, Nolan?
That's exactly the way I put it. When I talk to a local elected official in a town that's thinking about zoning reform, or they're having a housing affordability issue, or they're having issues that they think zoning is contributing to, I don't talk in terms of FAR. I don't even talk about an issue that I love, and I know Sara is passionate about too, minimum lot sizes. Don't talk about setbacks, all of that stuff. Most people live normal, happy lives, and they don't think about zoning all day. But if you put it in those terms, you can point to every city and every town, every suburb has a little neighborhood like this, where maybe there's a mixture of housing typologies. Yeah, you'll have detached single family homes, but you might have townhouses. You might have a duplex on the same block. You might have a corner grocery. In many cases, these are some of the most desirable neighborhoods in those jurisdictions, or they're some of the most beloved streets in those jurisdictions. And you really just have to point out to folks, hey, it's actually illegal to make some of our other more recently built neighborhoods more like this one. It's illegal if a developer wanted to come along and maybe take a greenfield and build a integrated mixed use neighborhood like this today, it would be very, very, very difficult under some of the current rules that you have. And when you frame it that way, I think the gears start turning. People don't think of Hong Kong or Dubai. They think of, hey, these apartment prohibitions are stopping us from having more great neighborhoods like this one. Maybe our rules on strict segregation of uses or these really high parking requirements that make neighborhood commercial difficult. Maybe those are standing in the way. And of course, I think everyone on this call would agree that's might be necessary. It's not sufficient to building great communities, but this is like the low-hanging fruit, I think, of reform. And a lot of folks start to get it when you can point to real existing neighborhoods that people know and love and say, what are the regulatory barriers currently in place to stopping us from having more neighborhoods like this?
We're going to get to concluding thoughts, but just to get into the nitty gritty a little bit, because I want everybody to understand how something like this works. When you talk about reducing or eliminating minimum parking requirements near a transit station, that plays out theoretically by reducing costs, because otherwise the developer has to have two and a half parking spaces built into their development per home. And if it's near a transit station and with people's lifestyles kind of changing, it's not even necessary or desirable. So what I want to know is, does it really end up reducing costs for the developer that translates into more affordability? Just to take that one reform. Nolan, I'll ask you that.
Yeah, well, so I mean, minimum parking requirements intersect with housing affordability on two margins. The first is if they're too high on many smaller lots where there's just not room for a surface parking lot or where the rents aren't high enough to cover the cost of structured parking, you just don't get housing there. That's the first element here is the parking requirements can just make many sites infeasible for infill development and they just sit vacant or they're used for a lower use like a one-story commercial building, not the type of thing that generally you would prefer to see near a major new transit line or a busy active busway. The second is parking requirements mean that the housing that is built is going to have to be more expensive. If you have to build structured parking, for example, that can increase the cost of each individual unit by $50,000 to $60,000, depending on local market conditions. Of course, if the market's not to a point where it can sustain that, those units just don't get built. And if the market is to a point, you just get more expensive units. Now, those, of course, help to relieve some pressure. That's not bad, but we should be talking about, hey, do we actually need these rules? And in many cases, parking requirements are actively in tension with broader planning objectives around transit stations. We build transit lines and we ideally want more development where folks who would prefer that mode of living to live car free, to walk, to be able to commute without a car. And parking requirements basically undermine some of these broader planning investments and objectives. So that's really low-hanging fruit. And we've seen a lot of uptake on that all over the country.
Everything Nolan said is true, and there have been studies to reinforce that. There are a few up at desegregate.org/parking if anybody's super interested in links. But I will say here in Hartford, where we became the first city to completely eliminate minimum parking requirements for every use in, I think, 2017, we saw developers who were able to both rehabilitate historic buildings and build new buildings without the kinds of huge parking garages that were required under the old code. In New Haven, which has not entirely eliminated its minimum parking requirements, but hopefully will soon, I was part of a project team for the largest apartment building in Connecticut called 360 State Street, built across the street from the State Street train station. And the city's zoning code and the development agreement for the site required 400 units, far more than that in terms of spaces. And so there's a 5 or 6 story parking garage across from the State Street station, when in reality, a much smaller garage could have been built, or maybe no garage at all. But those requirements added significantly to the cost of the building and drove up the rent prices for that building, even though it was 20% affordable units. It could have been even more affordable for the market rate housing.
Just to riff on this just a little bit more, the experience in California and in San Diego in particular has been that when you remove these rules, actually the main beneficiaries are 100% affordable buildings, particularly in a Southern California context where most folks who can afford it will probably want a car and want an off-street parking space to accommodate it. But with affordable projects, you might be serving tenants, you might be serving families that don't have a car. And so particularly with minimum parking requirements, there was some discussion of, can we get rid of these rules? We use them as a negotiating chip to get more affordable housing. Well, we actually know that removing these rules actually principally benefits 100% affordable projects.
Well, I know some of this is fairly recent. Has anybody done a study that shows that eliminate minimum parking requirements, say, for example, actually translates to more affordability?
We have used the Connecticut Zoning Atlas to conduct exactly that kind of research. Using our parcel by parcel zoning specific information, we have looked at the 15 most walk-friendly cities in the state and found that tens of thousands of units of housing can be created simply by eliminating minimum parking requirements alone and keeping every other zoning requirement exactly the same. Interestingly, we found that the place with the greatest opportunity was Bridgeport, Connecticut's largest city, which fortunately just eliminated its minimum parking requirements for housing. So we're hopeful that that will unlock new investment in Bridgeport, which is pretty close to New York City and like several of the large Connecticut cities, a struggling city economically. But that one single reform has a lot of promise here in Connecticut for the creation of new housing, which in turn will drive down prices. Connecticut, as in many other places around the country, the lack of housing and the difficulty of creating new housing is what drives up prices. So there is a link between the ability to create housing, minimum parking requirements, and affordability. That research will be out hopefully within the next 3 to 6 months.
Nolan, is there a record that you can point to where you have a zoning reform and the end result is affordability?
Yeah, I'll give you two quick examples. The first is the accessory dwelling unit legalization that happened in 2016 that I talked about previously. I highlight some of this data in my article in The Atlantic. You can literally see a line at 2016, and permitting before that line is basically zero. We were building no ADUs. And then after that, that's been exponential growth every single year. And it's likely just going to keep growing. California cities or neighborhoods are becoming much more affordable and much more diverse. Of course, we're facing a lot of pressure in housing markets, but this is a small positive reform where we empowered homeowners to build ADUs if they wanted to. They did them, and now we're getting all this new affordable supply. And there's been surveys to try to figure out what are the rents, what are these things being rented for. I think the Southern California Association of Governments estimated that something like 2/3 were being rented at rates that were affordable to folks at 80% of the area median income. So that's essentially affordable housing production at scale and at no cost to the taxpayer. And that's all just because of removing some of these zoning barriers to ADUs. Another example I like to highlight is Houston's minimum lot size reforms in 1998. Houston, of course, is famous or infamous, depending on your point of view, for not having zoning, but they have a few zoning-like rules on the books, and one of them was minimum lot sizes. And until 1998, they said if you want to build a detached single-family home, you have to have a 5,000 square foot lot. They lowered that in 1998 down to 1,400 square feet, essentially allowing your typical 5,000 square foot lot to be turned into 3 townhouses. They call them townhouses down there. It's Texas. They still have little 3-foot side setbacks because folks want their detached single family home. And that triggered a building boom of housing that was far more affordable than maybe that 1960s or 1970s ranch style home on a 5,000 square foot lot. In its place, you got 3 new townhouses. Many of these neighborhoods became denser, such that they could accommodate more commercial options, they could accommodate better transit. And then, of course, that helped to keep the city just broadly more affordable. More supply was coming online. There was less pressure, of course, for new sprawling development, and it generally helped keep the city affordable. There's a lot of low-hanging fruit like this, both at the state and local level, where cities can say, hey, we're dealing with a housing affordability crisis. What are the legacy zoning rules that we inherited that don't really reflect our planning objectives or values today that we can remove to facilitate some of that new affordable production?
All right, well, let's turn to concluding thoughts. Nolan, I want to turn to you, and then Sara, you'll have the last word. What is your view and outlook on the future of zoning and zoning reform?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I'm incredibly optimistic on this area. I wouldn't be working in this area. I wouldn't have written a book on zoning if I didn't think we weren't in a moment where there's a huge amount of potential. One of the benefits, again, of being at this crisis stage with a lot of these issues is folks are really looking for answers. They're really thinking about, hey, what are some of these policies that we inherited? To what extent do they reflect our objectives and the conditions that our cities face today? As I said previously, California YIMBY, we just had our best reform year yet. I look abroad and I am inspired by some of the stuff that I see happening in other states, particularly Connecticut. There's conversations like this happening in basically every state house and every town hall in the country on some level. So I think it's incredibly exciting. I think now's the time for planners who are in the civil service to make sure that your elected officials know about some of these reform ideas that are happening. Elected officials, there's an opportunity here to lead on this issue. And I think, as Sara put it, not only will you not suffer negative political consequences, it actually could be a springboard for being viewed as a leader, as someone who's really tackling tough issues. And then, I think for activists, right, get involved. Now's the time. I think there's an appetite here. In many cases, a lot of these policy decisions have been made purely by small groups of unrepresentative interest groups and created codes that made it very hard to build or benefited select populations. Go out to that planning hearing, talk to your elected official, ask them what they're doing on zoning reform. I think a lot of folks are thinking about this, and we have to strike while the iron's hot. I think these moments they come and go. I don't think zoning is going to be an issue area like education or immigration where it's something that we permanently think about. I think we're in a special moment where folks are asking these questions, and I think now's the time to push for reform. And I'm incredibly optimistic about the near future.
Sarah, what about you?
Yeah, I share Nolan's optimism. And I'll also just underscore that zoning reform is a bipartisan issue. We're seeing, especially in our National Zoning Atlas project, that projects are coming from states like Montana, New Hampshire, and Texas. People in those states, which you might consider to be red states, are interested in understanding how their local communities zone, and they are rapidly populating their atlases with information. And they'll be up, hopefully, Montana first and New Hampshire close behind, I think, pretty soon. But there's a lot of the bipartisan push for zoning reform that we're seeing across the country. I think the interest in collecting more information about zoning is really strong, and the critiques of zoning from lots of different angles can produce very beneficial results. And it's not just housing that's an important issue. It's also really even going back to the fundamentals of the way zoning regulates all of the uses to which we put land. So I think thinking through the big picture of zoning, including housing, is going to be a task for all of us in the years ahead.
Nolan Gray and Sara Bronin, thank you for this conversation.
And that is it for this episode of the Land Matters podcast. We have several publications on the subject of zoning, including articles in Landlines magazine and a book titled Zoning Rules. Just go to our website, lincolnits.edu. We hope you'll rate, share, and subscribe to the Land Matters podcast so you never miss a show. We'll have much more about cities and affordability and all the challenges that are in the mix for metropolitan regions right now, all coming up in the shows ahead. And don't forget also to follow the Lincoln Institute on Twitter. The handle is @LandPolicy. So until next time, I'm your host, Anthony Flint. Thanks for listening.